Today on the LowDOWN, the Down Syndrome podcast, Susan Fawcett gave us the lowdown on learning and development. Over to you, Hannah and Marla.
Thanks again, Andrew. So we're back today with Dr. Susan Fawcett, Director of Therapy, Behavior, and Family Support at the Down Syndrome Resource Foundation, to speak more about the learning profile of individuals with Down syndrome. Last time, Susan gave us the lowdown on the most probable strengths and challenges these students have. That information was intended as a starting guide for parents and educators so that they get a sense of the easiest way for children and older students to learn. Today, we're going to look at some of the most common questions we get asked regarding learning. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Marla Folden. Hey Marla, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm excited to talk to Susan again today.
Yes, welcome Susan. Thanks for coming back.
Thank you.
We want to do 5 secret questions again because some people may have missed the first episode and they might just not know you well enough yet. So are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. Number 1, what is your least favorite household chore?
Oh, I despise vacuuming.
What?
I love vacuuming.
I have this in common with children with Down syndrome. I do not like the loudness of it.
Loud.
Yeah.
But it's so efficient.
It is,
that?
and I see the immediate reinforcement you get from the immediately clean rug, and yet I do not like it.
Oh, fair enough.
No.
Okay. Number 2, do you have a favorite house plant? And if so, what would that be?
Well, I actually have it's not exactly a house plant, but I think my current favorite plant is outside on my patio, and that is, I have a couple of lavender trees, and they smell really good, and the bees come, and it is very wonderful.
Oh, yeah. Excellent. I have lavender too. It is wonderful. Did you, during more severe quarantine, pick up any fun quarantine hobbies?
No, but my baking amplified severely. Yeah. I didn't do anything new, but I did do a lot of baking.
Excellent.
And then I ate it all.
Yeah, I know, that was my problem too.
I was just going to say, when you're in quarantine, there's no one else to feed it to, so you got to eat it all, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So many
It wasn't
yummy
good.
things.
It wasn't pretty.
Do you have any quarantine tips? Hannah had a cool name for that. Quarantine tips.
Any corn tips?
Corn tips.
Yeah.
Well, I think the one that we've all been giving ad nauseum, which is to make sure that you stick to your routine, is probably my biggest one. And making sure that you have, little fun things that you do throughout your day to break it up a little, I think are good corn tips.
Yeah. Excellent corn tips.
Last question, number 5. What is your ideal way to spend a weekend day?
Oh, a weekend day. Well, I do enjoy hiking these days quite a lot. And so I'd say hiking and then some cooking and baking.
Delicious treats. I agree with that. First you hike and then you say, I can eat whatever I make.
Yeah,
it's perfect.
Exactly.
It works out well.
Yeah, for sure.
It's that whole, reinforcement, positive reinforcement thing you talked about in the last episode too.
That's correct.
Yes.
That may come up again today. Who
It might.
knows?
Okay, we'll
Just
see.
a little teaser.
Okay, great.
All right, well, let's get right into it. One of the most common issues that families bring up is that their child will demonstrate a skill in one environment, but not in another, and this is confusing for families. So let's start by talking about that. How do we figure out what's happening and why?
So what you're talking about there is a cognitive skill called generalization, which typically refers to the phenomenon in which a child can take a skill learned in one setting and then apply it in another setting, or one that they've done with one person and apply it with another person. And it's actually a skill that we know that kids with intellectual disabilities of all kinds have a lot of trouble with. So, I remember just a quick example, being a new SLP here and having quite a lot of success teaching this little adorable 7-year-old, who's now 22, how to say the S sound. And she was doing beautifully with it. it. She was originally saying things instead of salad, she would say talad, right? So she would replace the S with a T or a D. But she was really getting it at our sessions. She was getting it in all sorts of word positions and being quite frequently successful with it. But then I'd watch her walk to the elevator after our session, and she would stand by the elevator with her mom, and she'd be like, "Bye, Dudan." And I was like, ugh. That was 30 seconds ago. You just called me Susan, and now I'm Dudan again. So even going from my office to the elevator, she could no longer perform the skill. So then what are her odds of actually being able to do that at home, in the car on the way home, once she gets to school? I mean, those odds are not high, right? So it's basically why we have to approach teaching kids with Down syndrome in a much more structured, planful way. So it absolutely can be done, but it takes more effort on the part of both adults and the kids too, because it's going to take longer to accomplish the goals. So in order to promote generalization of skills, a few things need to be in place. So one being that everybody has to be on board. So the whole team. So family and school involvement for sure, and there has to be kind of commitment across those people. Another thing that really is helpful is working on generalizing only a handful of skills at a time. Even sometimes just one at a time is a good idea, but definitely no more than 2 or 3. So, if it's a child who's coming to DSRF and they have 2 different therapies, they're going to SLP and OT, maybe you're working on generalizing 1 OT skill and 1 SLP skill, and then that's it for now, right? And then the other thing you really want to do is employing something that the fancy name of it is called general case programming, which is essentially ensuring that we planfully sample across environments and people, as well as a varied set of behavioral examples. So that would be in the example of the S, not just practicing S in one word, but in many words, in many different positions within the word. And it's really all about practice then. So then, at home, practicing that complete list of behavioral examples with mom and dad and sister and brother and friends. Also practicing it not just sitting at the dining room table, but also in the bathroom and maybe out in the community at the grocery store, when we get to go back there. And then at school, the same thing, practicing with your EA, not just with your EA or your speech therapist, but also with your teachers, with your peers, in the classroom, but also in the hallway, the playground, the gym, all of those places. And the more you can practice in, the better it is. So basically not just the little round table in the broom closet where the SLP is. You definitely want to take it on. Out there. Yeah, sorry,
we know you're
school
in a
SLPs. You're definitely in the closet.
We know.
So it's why you will often see therapists and teachers at DSRF for those families who come here, moving this with the students around the building to practice skills, right? And we do this all the time. SLPs do this all the time with social skills, right? So we work on things like conversation starters and eye contact and things like that, not just in our own office, but once the student starts to get a bit more confident, we do a road trip, right? And I go over to Marla's office, she comes to my office, that kind of thing. So, and then just a quick note regarding expectations around generalization of skills. It's not really appropriate to expect kids who are just beginning to learn a skill to be able to do it right away or perfectly or in all environments. And so demonstrating a bit of patience where that is concerned.
So you're saying it's not stubbornness?
No, oddly enough, it's not.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, certainly if our students could, they would, because it would be easier for them too.
It can take a while. It definitely requires some patience for sure.
And prioritizing, I think too. Because often there's a lot of things you can and should work on, and picking what's most important right now that we learn across all of our environments and sticking with it until you've got it. It is tempting to leave things too soon.
Yes, and that's another good point too, is that we know it takes a lot more repetition, you know, in and of itself. Even aside from generalization, it just takes more repetition for kids with Down syndrome to get a skill in the first place. So definitely it's an exercise in patience for sure.
I guess it just depends on the skill too, because some skills may have 1 or 2 sub-skills. Some may have 6 or 7 different components working together, so that just prolongs the generalization, or at least the learning and then the generalization part of it, right?
Yeah.
So,
I'm thinking more about expectations, and what would be some sort of signs or things that you could look for in a daycare or school setting that would tell you whether staff are sort of overestimating what a person with Down syndrome can do?
Yeah, so that is a really interesting question. So why does that happen? Because it happens quite
and then
often.
we get told, oh, they're being lazy, oh,
yes,
they're stubborn.
Yes, that is exactly what happens. So, you know, it can be really hard to gauge, I think, just for people who aren't, I mean, we all are around, the 3 of us in this room are around kids with Down syndrome all the time, right? So, but for people who aren't around kids with Down syndrome all the time and don't really have an idea of where, you know, the range of abilities for a given age or developmental level, it can be really hard to gauge what level their skills are at in the first place. So, and on top of that, they're often variable from day to day. Totally. And I think that really plays into it, because some days they might be able to do all sorts of things because they had a good sleep and they've eaten well and they've had lots of exercise and they haven't been tired out by doing something else already earlier in the day. And they're feeling well, right? They don't have some sort of respiratory illness going on. And on those days, you know, they do really well. Maybe in the domain of speech and language therapy, they can say a 5-word sentence. But it's important to realize that that's not going to happen all the time, for most kids. And so they're variable from day to day, as well as across skill domains as well. And so we definitely get both that under and overestimating a lot. And I would say both from, you know, EAs and teaching professionals, but also from parents too. It definitely happens with parents as well. One example would be that lots of our kids don't talk as much at school compared to therapy sessions or at home, right? So, and that can be several reasons. You know, the kid is maybe what we just talked about. They haven't yet generalized whatever these new skills are to the school setting. They're likely really overstimulated at school, and so using their cognitive capacity to draw on that and then be able to access those skills at school is going to be hard. And there's, you know, like all the loud noises and the lights and all the stuff to look at. You know, it can be really hard for them. Or a kid may even have something like an anxiety disorder. So we know that social anxiety and selective mutism are not uncommon in kids with Down syndrome. So those things may make it look like the child is less capable than they actually are, right? Because they're actually able to do a lot of things at home, but they're not yet doing it at school. There's definitely a couple signs to watch out for that may indicate that school personnel don't have a really good read on the child's actual level. And one of them was the one that you just mentioned, Marla, which is it's definitely really frustrating to hear people say, oh, she's just being lazy. Because that essentially tells me that person doesn't understand the learning profile of children with Down syndrome. You know, lazy in that scenario indicates that the child is actually completely capable of performing the skill in question and that they're actively choosing not to do it because they'd rather just lie on the floor, right? But that's often not the case for kids with Down syndrome. More often, it's that they can't actually do that skill on their own, or it's overwhelming in that particular moment, right? And then, Another thing that's a bit of a red flag for me that there might be over or underestimating of skills going on is if there's too much help happening. So, you know, on the underestimating side, this is basically like doing too much for the child, even things that you know they can do themselves. And parents will sometimes tell me about that. Well, she can, you know, put on her coat just fine at home, and now I just watch her EA put it on for her at school. That's interesting, right? So we don't want to get into a, you know, learned helplessness situation, right? Where you're doing way too much for the kid, and they just essentially learn that, you know, I can't really do things for myself, and I'm just going to let others do it for me. On the overestimating side, what we sometimes see happening is a child will say something and the EA or the teacher might translate for them, right? And the translating also comes with an interpretation or more language that wasn't actually there, right? And so it makes it look like they're functioning at a higher level than they actually are. But in both cases, the impression you get is that the school personnel is giving too much assistance of some kind. So on the flip side, I really love when I go into a school and I see EAs and teachers, and I do see this quite a bit, actively encouraging independence in the kids with Down syndrome. So, you know, note that though, that this is not just like plopping the child in circle time and sitting over here and drinking your coffee. That's not what I'm talking about. It's not just leaving the child alone and leaving them to their own devices, right? It's being close by, but not on top of them. You know, it's providing minimal or just the right level of prompting when needed, but letting them have an opportunity to try to do it themselves first. And, you know, rewarding effort and talking a lot about, I like how independent you were. You did that by yourself. That was amazing. You know, that kind of thing. Yeah, those are some of the things that definitely can point to that maybe, you know, they don't have a good read on the level.
And I think, you know, with doing sort of too much for the student, often that comes with the absolute best of intentions, where whoever is supporting the student is very empathetic and recognizes that, you know, there's medical things, there's health stuff, there's sleep, etc., etc. I'm going to make this person's life easier. And what's hard to recognize about that is that in the long term, you are not making that person's life easier, because they need to practice those skills. We know that those things take a lot longer to learn, especially for the level of independence that we hope for. So yeah, too much help is not help.
Yeah, it's not. But you're right. It is often coming from a good place.
Sure.
I'm glad you pointed that out. It very often is, for sure. I think just one quick note about what might be helpful there is, again, a lot of this comes down to really good communication amongst therapy team, home, and school, right? And what are you seeing this kid doing in therapy sessions? What is he doing at home with regard to this skill, and what is he doing at school? And making sure that there's no big discrepancies there, right?
Oh yeah, and I've definitely been surprised before. I'll be working on some very high level language thing with a student, let's say narratives or telling stories, that kind of thing. And then when it comes time to have the IEP meeting and they say, oh, we would really like them to say hi to anyone ever. I'm like, whoa. Like, that would have been good to know much sooner that this person's not talking in school whatsoever. Yeah. Those kinds of things, letting us know would be great.
Yeah. Do you, for listeners out there, I've had this conversation with, if I go and present to a school district or a classroom, and teachers will come and ask, how they can get that conversation started with parents, or parents vice versa will ask, how do we get that conversation started with the teachers and EAs about assessing how much support the student needs and trying to figure out the learning profile? Like, do you have any tips or advice on how to initiate that conversation with someone who is either over or underestimating a student with Down syndrome?
Oh, yeah, because it could be a tricky thing to
like, how do you bring it up?
Yeah. So I think probably the easiest way of doing it, and the least sort of confrontational, would be just to talk about things that, you know, the child is doing at home or in therapy environments. I think video is really helpful in those instances, right? So basically, you know, showing them, hey, they did this in their therapy session yesterday. Isn't this cool? And then, you know, that usually will spark a conversation about, oh, never seen him even pick up a pencil, let alone write, his whole
sentence
name.
or whatever.
So I think that that's probably that would be
great
my
idea.
number one tip.
Yeah, and when there's big discrepancies, it can be really hard to even fathom. Like if you're working with someone and you're not seeing very many skills, and then you hear that they're writing whole sentences, you're like, wow, what does that even look like? So seeing a video is really a great way to see what supports are used and all of that. It's good.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about motivation during our last episode, which is a huge factor when working with kiddos with Down syndrome. So after the break, we're going to talk to Susan about what the best way is to help our kiddos with Down syndrome stay interested in learning. So stay with us and we'll be right back.
Show the world you love someone with Down syndrome. DSRF Down Syndrome's Wake Shop is stocked with shirts, baby clothes, bags, and more. Whether you're looking for World Down Syndrome Day products, DSRF brand merchandise, or general Down syndrome items, we have what you're looking for. Love live on 21st chromosome, and Down syndrome Wake lives at dsrf.org/shop.
My name is Andrew. I am the photographer. Photos are my interest because I love scenes. It makes me feel very close to people. My photos cards are on my Etsy shop through Andrew's eyes at dsrf.org/Andrew. Don't forget to watch my video through Andrew's eyes on YouTube.
Okay, so welcome back to the Lowdown. We're here with Dr. Susan Fawcett, who is our Director of Therapy, Behavior, and Family Support Services at the DSRF. And before the break, we were going to dive into a topic that I find fascinating, which is motivation and Down syndrome. And it is a topic that I like to talk to teachers and SEAs and parents about because I find that it's really important. It's an important consideration when working with our kiddos with DS. So, Susan, can you talk to us a little bit about what the best way to help a child with Down syndrome stay interested in their learning?
I sure can. Maybe I'll just give a quick recap of what intrinsic motivation is. Just for people who, if they didn't listen to the first one. So intrinsic motivation is essentially our internal drive to get stuff done, right? So it's when we do something just because it feels good to have accomplished it, right? So we have that kind of internal get up and go. Our intrinsic motivation as typically developing adults varies from day to day. So some days we have lots and some days it's hard to make ourselves do what needs to get done. And why it's important here is what we're talking about today is because of structural and functional brain differences, people with Down syndrome have a consistently low level of intrinsic motivation. And there are ways to get around it. So I'm sure you two, Marla and Hina, hardly ever have days. I imagine you both leaping out of bed with joy every morning to accomplish everything you need to get done in your days. But if you ever have a day like that, where you feel you have a low level of intrinsic motivation, I'd love to hear how you get through it. So do you just kind of lie in bed and pull the covers up over your head and just say, no, I'm not facing today? Or how do you get yourself through a day like that?
If I have a hard time getting going and getting myself motivated to get out of bed and go to work, I try to give myself a reason or an incentive to do so. So it's like, all right, Hina, get out of bed, get changed, maybe grab a Starbucks on the way to work. That'll be a nice little treat, so maybe I'll do that. That'll kind of keep me motivating to get into it.
I gotta have more coffee.
Yeah.
Make a list so that I know it's actually manageable. I try and exercise or do something. So I always walk to work, but if it's not a work day and I'm still feeling like low motivation, I mean, I have a toddler, so can't stay in bed. It's not happening. But we got to get out of the house and just get moving and get going, and then the day helps get itself moving. Yeah.
Okay, so we all have strategies, right, for what to do about these kinds of things. So we all need to have that stuff in place for ourselves sometimes, right? And you guys basically just mentioned, you mentioned a few things here. You mentioned building in more extrinsic rewards rather than internal ones. So coffee, right? You mentioned reasoning with yourself. Like, I just have to get through this. I'm going to make a list that will make it easier. Giving yourself breaks or more things that you could do, that like the exercise, right? That would help you get up and get going. And you can reason yourself into doing that because you're cognitively typical. Okay, so we need to have those kinds of things in place for kids with Down syndrome all the time, not just on certain days, right? They may still vary within their range of this intrinsic motivation, but they're always a bit on the low end. So it's really best to think about this one in a behavioral way. And if you're lacking motivation that comes from within you, then what do you need to do instead? Well, you need to build in more external motivation. And that takes planning and extra effort, but you will be very happy you did it for your kid because it works really well. Because of course we don't have the option with these kids of having them reason themselves through, well, if I just, get out of bed now, it'll make my life so much easier later on today. They're not, a kid with Down syndrome is never going to do that. Okay, so what you want to do is try these external motivation things, and there's a bunch of things you can do, but the three that I would suggest starting with, number one being incorporating preferences into learning activities that are not preferred, or any kind of task that is not preferred.
That's a really good one.
So we basically need to make those activities more appealing. So this is essentially putting cheese sauce on broccoli, right? That's why we put cheese sauce on broccoli for children, right? We want them to eat the broccoli. We don't really care how the nutrients get in the body. So we can just slather some good old cheese on there, and it works pretty well. So you basically are making work or tasks that are not appealing less aversive, right? The same way that you're making broccoli less aversive and more appealing. So if I give Marla, if I offer you an extra long worksheet of math problems, really hard ones, that's just plain and just all the problems are just staring you in the face, and I just push that towards you on the table, how are you feeling right now?
Not fantastic.
Okay,
it's been
but
a while since I've done that.
now what if I give you another one that has all those math problems on it, but then also cute pictures of Finn, your son? What if those are on there too?
Yeah, I would at least get started for sure.
You would probably want to do it, right? Or at least you'd tolerate it a bit better.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's one example. So there are, how to make work more appealing is really bound only by your own creativity. So, if a child, for example, doesn't like walking or walking in the specific format of transitioning between one activity to the next, then you can walk like a bear, or you can have a race, or you can sing songs while you walk. I had one mom in my dissertation project who learned this skill so well. It was amazing. She got her daughter to walk home from school by kicking a soccer ball all the way home, which made it really fast and really effective. And she also, the other thing that her daughter had a lot of trouble with was brushing her teeth. And so what she did was turn the bathroom into a nightclub. So they had a disco ball, they had the lights off, they had like some pretty awesome electronic music playing, and they would all brush their teeth together as a family and dance at the same time. Now, some of you may be thinking, but Susan, that's a lot of work. Okay, well, it is a little bit of work. I agree with you. It does take a little bit of extra effort and planning, and you might have to go buy a disco ball. But is that worth it if you now are going to have a joyous time every time you brush your teeth? Probably.
Versus tantrum and prolonged fighting over it every time. Yes.
Exactly. Okay, so that's sort of what you have to weigh that for yourself there. You can also put favorite characters on schedules or worksheets or toothbrushes. You can make any kind of learning activity into some sort of fun game. There are a million different ways to do that. Your friendly neighborhood DSRF therapist can help you think of things for that. That would work for your particular child, and reading materials that are solely focused on your child's favorite things is also a good idea. The second way of building in more extrinsic motivation is to give more choices around activities, around non-preferred activities. So about what activities to do, when to do them, how much to do them, do you want to do 3 math problems or do you want to do 4 math problems, right? And maybe that's not a whole lot right now, but maybe eventually you build up to, do you want to do 2 math worksheets or 3 math worksheets, right? And you would just gradually build that up. This increases buy-in, increases independence, as well as motivation. And then the last thing would be to give lots of, and this is probably the most important one, is to give lots of positive reinforcement via both social and tangible rewards. So Hina, I'll give you an extra long math worksheet now. Okay, so yeah, she's making a face at me. Of course, you guys can't see that, but she's making a face at me. So I am giving her an extra long math worksheet, and she doesn't look happy about it. But what if I tell you that after every 3 questions, you get a small piece of 80% dark chocolate?
Oh yes, game changer.
Game changer,
Right?
Yeah. Okay, so what you have to do is just find those kinds of tangible rewards that are appealing to your child. It does not have to be chocolate, by the way, that will help them through these difficult activities. But maybe even more powerful for kids with Down syndrome is praise and rewards for adaptive behavior that are social. And so this is basically verbal and social praise, or interaction kinds of praise, right? So we know that kids with Down syndrome eat that stuff up, right? That's their jam for sure. So if you can build in lots of praise, high fives and fist bumps and clapping and singing and dance parties for, for good adaptive behavior, then that's going to be really helpful. And I think that's about it for the kinds of things that we want to do in order to keep kids learning. I mean, those should really help for sure.
And I think in our consultations or school visits, I'm sure both of you have found this, when we give, these are like 3 very basic, easy to implement strategies, and I've noticed, along with visual supports, but these 3, incorporating preferences, giving choice, and positive reinforcement makes such a big difference with just starting. It's not like a really huge thing that we're asking you to really implement. They're very simple. Like choice, I found, is so powerful. Like just giving, even if it's like as simple as, do you want the blue marker or the red marker? And if you do it in a very excited way, then they're more willing to be like, oh, okay, I'll do this printing activity with Hina because she's giving me some control over how it's going to play out. So I find that is super powerful and easy to implement too.
Oh, definitely. And I think, our students have very little control over their lives, even less control than typically developing children do. So if we can give them any control over the things that they have to do, it goes a really long way into getting some buy-in. Yeah.
And then hopefully they know that the next time Hina's going to do printing, it'll be very similar.
Hina's got fun printing activities.
Hina's going to be the fun. Exactly. And then hopefully the follow-through will be a bit easier with each time that you do that activity.
Right? That's exactly what will happen. If you do it the right way, and if it doesn't happen that way, then you're not doing it right.
And then basically. It's easier for you in the long term too, hopefully, right? That's kind of, that's really great. Those
you
awesome.
need to be more fun if it's not quite working.
Yeah, exactly.
That being said, though, sometimes you do have to switch up your strategy.
Yes.
So only offering the same choice or the same whatever, it will work for a while.
Yeah.
It will stop working, and then you got to switch it up and try, Paw Patrol printing or something else to make it new and exciting and still fun in a new way.
Yeah.
And I've run into that issue a lot where you guys are like, I'm doing the thing, it doesn't work anymore. So it was working, and then it's just a matter of fine-tuning or switching for a little bit, offering something different.
Yeah, you have to have lots of different tools in your toolbox. And this is why we also say, with regard to, verbal praise, you don't want to just say good job all the time, right? I mean, it's fine to say good job sometimes, but you got to throw in some other stuff. Yeah.
That's a very good point.
Because otherwise kids just stop hearing it, right? Yeah.
Okay, let's shift tracks a little bit and talk about, it's related, I guess. So many families and educators get really confused by the fact that our students do so much better one-on-one and with an adult. So what is it about peers that is so difficult? So for example, a student might be able to have a really good conversation with their therapist or with an adult, maybe their parent, but they can't seem to do that with a peer. So what's going on there, do you think?
Yeah, there are lots and lots of reasons for that. So I think one of the really big ones is that peers are just less patient than adults are, right? So, if an adult, such as a teacher or a therapist, doesn't understand something a child with Down syndrome has said, they'll keep trying, right? Whereas a peer, especially a younger peer, will just walk away because they just, they're like, well, I didn't get that, so I guess the conversation's over. Adults, such as teachers and therapists, also give a lot of help, right? So, and kids learn that they can rely on that a little bit. We all give a lot of encouraging facial cues and body language that's very welcoming and encouraging, right? And if you think about, older kids and teenagers with Down syndrome, what are their peers doing? Well, they're not giving encouraging body language, right? Most teenagers have very, this conversation is shut down body language, right? So they have the exact opposite appearance of what we as therapists or teachers or lots of parents would do. And we also give a lot of positive reinforcement for trying, right? So we don't just reward them with continuing the conversation when they actually are completely successful. We also say things like, you're doing a really good job. I can't quite get what you just said, but we're going to figure it out, right? That kind of thing. And so likely because of all that effort on the part of the adult, children with Down syndrome basically learn that adults are more fun to interact with, and they feel more comfortable and confident around us than they do around their peers. Essentially, we're giving them the time of day is basically what's happening. But it doesn't mean that you can't teach, people to be successful in their interactions with peers. But it requires training and encouragement on both sides. So I think we spend lots of time teaching the child with Down syndrome to speak more clearly and to have better social skills and that kind of thing. I think what we don't do such a good job of is the other side, right? Teaching the peers why it's important to both why it's important to encourage that child to interact with you, as well as how to do it, right? And how to keep the conversation going and that kind of thing. So it's really not fair if you think about it. We're putting a lot of onus on the kid with fewer skills, which isn't really that great. So basically both the kid with Down syndrome and the child who's typically developing need to both be taught strategies for how to make the conversation successful.
There are some cool resources around that the DSRF will put out right before the next school year. And it's going to include a little bit of information that's intended to go from a parent of a kid with Down syndrome to other parents. So if questions come up at home, like, this kid's trying to talk to me and I don't know what to do, that child's parents can say, oh, you can try asking them to slow down, and we can work with the other peers to make things a little bit easier for our students too. So you can check the DSRF website for that starting in the fall.
Great. We've done a few, with COVID right now, this is on hold, but in the past we have been asked to go to schools and do like inclusion presentations where we talk to peers about, a classmate of theirs that has Down syndrome and, how you can interact with them, how you can use the adults in the classroom to do those communication repair strategies that you guys work on. So kind of also, and I think that's a really good point, is that we do focus so much on the individual with Down syndrome figuring it all out, but problem solving is, it's a two-way street. So helping the peers also understand how to do that. And
Yeah, ideally
On a
we'd have
bigger
a meet
scale
in the
is nice.
middle situation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Sure.
that would be ideal.
Another question for you here, Susan, and this one comes up a lot, and parents' perspectives change over the years on this one. And the question is, what kind of friends should parents be advocating for their child? Are we advocating for typically developing peers only, or other peers with special needs or different needs? What are your thoughts on friend groups and friends?
Right. So I mean, it might surprise people, but I would definitely focus on the latter. So I would focus on finding friends who also have developmental disabilities of some kind. And I'll explain why I think that. When I was pretty new to this job, and I used to listen to parents who had kids who were in primary grades, and they would gush a lot about, and she gets all these high fives when she walks down the hall, and she's so famous, and everybody loves her, and everybody wants to be her friend, and they hold hands with her and they help her. And it was quite heartwarming, the first few times I heard this story. And it used to make me feel pretty happy, but now it makes me feel more concerned when I hear that. But it's a really tough thing to talk about because parents are often really content about peer relationships at that time. And you guys know me, I'm not really fond of being a buzzkill. So, but what I quickly learned was that by about grade 4, the kid with Down syndrome wasn't as popular anymore. There's many reasons for that. It's no longer a novelty to have somebody in your class who has Down syndrome. This is now somebody who's been there for a long time. Teachers are likely not emphasizing those pro-social behaviors that they were really emphasizing in kindergarten and grade 1 and grade 2, because there's a lot of academic stuff now to cover for them. On the same vein, the typically developing students also have more academic work and less time for developing relationships and doing some of those more pro-social things. They have harder work, they have more activities, they have more responsibility. And then adding to all of that, the gap between the child with Down syndrome and the typically developing peers is now getting quite wide, right? We know this gap widens as they get older. So not only is the kind of academic work that they're doing not the same anymore, but the interests of the students aren't the same anymore either. Okay, so now you've got, basically, it's not unusual for one of our students with Down syndrome, who's 9 and in grade 4, to be still really into Peppa Pig or Paw Patrol or maybe the Wiggles, right? But you would not find very many typically developing kids who are genuinely into those things. And then even if you get a really altruistic, empathetic, typically developing peer, you think about, us 3 as children, right? We were probably that person. It's going to be kids who later turn into therapists or teachers, right? And there's usually 1 or 2 of those in every class. And, even when that person shows interest in whatever the child with Down syndrome's interest is, the interest is feigned, right? It's not a real interest. It's not genuine. And is that what real friendship is based on? Yeah. It's not, right? So what parents and educators have to think about really, and be honest with yourself about is who the child with Down syndrome's peer group is going to be later on. So think about later elementary school, think about high school, think about early adulthood. Are they going to form and keep strong, genuine friendship bonds with people with whom they have little in common? Or are they going to have strong bonds with people who they have genuine overlap in interests and ability? It's going to be the latter group for sure. And think about just a little perspective taking exercise for a minute. What would happen to your self-esteem if you hung around with people who were way smarter than you all the time? Right? It wouldn't be very good. You would probably feel like you couldn't keep up. That would be one thing that would happen. And you would definitely feel like you didn't fit in. So your self-esteem would probably suffer. And I think this is maybe what it feels like for older kids and teens and adults with Down syndrome who are only hanging around with typically developing peers. And I talk about this not to make people sad or to discourage relationships between typically developing children and children with developmental disabilities, but to encourage people to be proactive and just seek out opportunities for the child with Down syndrome to engage with peers who also have intellectual disabilities, and not just, typically developing kids. And on a really positive note, I mean, we all see here lots of lasting, valuable, positively heartwarming examples of good, solid friendships between adults who have intellectual disabilities. That absolutely does happen, but it takes legwork, right?
It does.
That does not just happen. Those are parents who have been really committed for a really long period of time, right? So we know that initiation isn't great in children and adults with Down syndrome, so they don't tend to initiate play dates and things like that, so they'll need help with that. They'll need help with, hey, we should have a play date with somebody. Who do you want to have a play date with? And guiding them through that is going to be, you shouldn't expect them to just come up with that off the top of their head. It's probably not going to happen. So basically, you're going to have to, as a parent and other team members, we all need to put in a little extra work there. And, the last thing I'll say is that basically, having a meaningful friendship or meaningful relationships is part of, having a really satisfying quality of life, right? So we know that encompasses a lot of things. So satisfying work relationships and being good at things. And there's a bunch of different things there, but one of them is definitely meaningful relationships. We know that can really enhance quality of life. And we have to really keep that in mind when we think about mental health as well. So, adolescents and adults with Down syndrome are definitely prone to having low self-esteem, and lots of them are prone to also becoming depressed and having clinical depression. And so a lack of meaningful friendships is almost certainly a contributing factor there. So, and I would say too, just to, if the listeners want to start acting on this, and I really hope that lots of people do, and developing that kind of peer group that's a real peer group, not a just one between a child with Down syndrome and typically developing peers. A few things you can try are I think Special Olympics, which is now available for kids too, is a really good place to start. Meeting other families via DSRF events, finding, or even, the therapists that we will often say, I think this kid and this kid would get along really well, right? And so we can connect kids that way. The therapists here often do that. So asking your therapist, hey, do you think there's somebody else around? My daughter is 12 now and she doesn't really have any friends at school. Do you think there's somebody here who has similar interests to her? And 9 times out of 10, there probably is, right? Might mean driving between West Vancouver and Chilliwack or something like that, but you can make it work. Or finding even just 1 or 2 other kids at your child's school who they might have something in common with and who also have around the same level of intellectual ability. I don't know if you two have any other suggestions around that.
I was actually, as you were talking, I was thinking of a group similar to that that's already formed by one of our parents, and they call it the Friday Friends group.
Right,
and so this is one of our DSRF moms that started this, and her and a few of their other parents, not all of them live in the same area, but generally, and they meet every Friday, and this has been going on for a few years. They meet every Friday for an activity, for a movie, they learn to cook, whatever the activity is. And I have worked with a few of those students, and I 100% agree with you that the friendship that is formed and it's meaningful, they're so excited to talk about what they're doing. Oh, I know this person from Friday Friends. And so parents can start something like that on their own too, and just if there's nothing there for you, then you can create it and have that experience for your kids. So.
I think the thing that comes to mind for me is that even in the scenario where your child has maintained some level of relationship with typically developing peers, even up through high school, I challenge you to think about after high school, because those it's hard to think about, but those peers are probably going to move away.
Yeah.
And you got to have some kind of safety net there for your child, because they are still going to need peers after that time, and especially after high school when there's so many big changes. So, and you can have both. My goodness, you don't have to choose one or the other.
Yeah.
No.
But yeah, think about it.
Yeah. It's not very. Doesn't tend to be a regular thing after high school is over. Yeah, I'm thinking of one particular young lady who had a friend all the way through high school. They hung out almost every weekend, and then that friend moved away to university, right? And now they see each other once per semester, if that. And the young lady with Down syndrome does not really understand why, and it's tough, and she doesn't have a lot of other friends. So, that's pretty
Cultivated
common.
early. Yeah.
Susan, are there any resources you would recommend to parents or teachers who want to better understand the unique learning strengths and needs of people with Down syndrome? Anything that are some of your go-tos?
Yes, for sure. So you just mentioned, Marla, the looking on the DSRF website for sure, because we have a lot of good resources on there. So we have a lot of videos about learning profiles, and Jill and Riley have that early communication one. There's ones on teaching reading, and those all talk about what some appropriate expectations are for kids. And then, the magazine and the blog posts are really good. We now have we're starting to develop a section on Down syndrome and autism, and what might be some appropriate expectations for those kids, and how to help their learning more specifically. And then just a couple books that, one in particular that I really like, and you guys probably, you should chime in here too, because you probably have ones that you really like. I think the classic Libby Kuman, the Helping Children with Down Syndrome Communicate Better, is probably one of the most approachable texts for families and educational professionals, that kind of gives a very well-rounded overview of their learning strengths and challenges. But do you two have others that you really like in your...
One of my go-tos, if I ever have practicum students or anybody that's not super familiar with Down syndrome ask me about it, there is a presentation that actually you did, Susan, that is on the learning profile of Down syndrome, where you kind of cover everything that we've talked about in a podcast, but in a presentation way and with examples and stuff. So I feel like that was super helpful, because it gives a really good primer on some of these strategies. That's one of mine, but
I have a couple of favorite things. I really like the social thinking material.
Yes.
I think it outlines really well where some of the challenge areas are for our students, even though it's not intended specifically for our population of students. It has a lot of concrete activities and strategies that are useful, particularly around things like starting a conversation, joining a conversation, being in a group with other people. I would say it's most relevant for our teenage and young adult students. I like that a lot. And lately we've been making really good use of the sort of ready, do, done framework put out by Sarah Ward. Thanks, Hannah. Those are really great materials that are very useful and helpful to sort of, I think I want to say, balance out the sort of uneven skill set that some of our students with Down syndrome have, and allow for more independence. So I use those things a lot with families, and they find that they're approachable and easy to use. So I like those. Susan, did you have any projects going on? It's weird times. It's COVID still, everyone. But do you have anything ongoing right now that you'd like to chat about?
No, I really don't. I mean,
it's hard to do a project when there's a pandemic.
There really is.
There really, there's a lot going on. I guess the one thing that we could mention is that the DSRF is putting out some videos now, short ones, that are intended for families and schools that sort of give a rundown of essential topics in Down syndrome, I guess I would say. So we have one that talks about what is Down syndrome, and that's for schools, particularly children in schools, to explain what it is and what it isn't, and how Down syndrome is not a sickness. So that is very helpful.
Yep.
And people have enjoyed that. Hina and I worked together on one about sensory processing and challenges that are often faced by people with Down syndrome. That one is helpful and useful. And there's another one about speech. And forthcoming, there will be one about Down syndrome and autism, dual diagnosis, as well as functional behavior assessment. So, and probably more on reading when we get down the line there too.
Yep.
So look for those, because that'll give you at least an overview of a lot of these topics. Thanks so much for coming again, Susan. It's always a pleasure to pick your brain on everything. And we've been looking forward to this for a while.
And I can already think of 2 more topics that we would love to have you back on.
Okay, great.
Multiple times. So
Perfect.
this is not the last of you for sure.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
I love it.
Yeah. we
Thanks,
appreciate
guys.
it. Okay.
Yeah.
Next week on the Lowdown, a Down syndrome podcast.
Sleeping is something that we learn how to do. Sleeping is a learned behavior. We're taught how to sleep. All babies will drink milk at birth. But what a 5-year-old eats throughout the planet will be different. And when you visit other countries, the first thing you want to look at is what are the foods there. So the need to eat is biological, but what you eat is cultural. Sleeping is the same way. The need for sleep is biological, but the way you sleep is learned. And we teach our kids how to sleep. And that's something that I like to get into, how the entire family sleeps.
The Lowdown, the Down syndrome podcast, is a production of Down Syndrome Research Foundation. Learn more at dsof.org and join the conversation at DSOF Canada on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The Lowdown is hosted by Marla Fodan and Hannah Mahmood, and is produced by Glenn Hughes. The Lowdown theme music and George Do was written and recorded by Rick Scott.